For joining this live town hall discussion on the COVID-19 virus. This town hall is hosted by Congressman Denny Heck, who represents Washington's 10th Congressional District. We are thrilled to be joined tonight by Dr. Trevor Bedford, a computational biologist at Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. We've been collecting questions from you through social media and constituent mail, and we'll be using those questions to drive this discussion. If you're watching this live on Facebook and have a question, please ask it in the comments section of this video, and we'll try to get to some of the questions from live viewers as well. Before we get to questions, I'm going to hand it over to Congressman Heck and then Dr. Bedford for some opening remarks. Congressman Heck?
Thank you, Lauren, very much. Thank all of you who are watching. This is, I think, the 9th or the 10th in our series of conversations with experts about the status of our efforts to respond to the coronavirus pandemic. And I am especially pleased, if not delighted, to have Dr. Trevor Bedford here this evening, who has become a little bit of an international celebrity, actually, as the coronavirus detective. And I want him to make some opening comments and get right into this. But Dr. Bedford, in your opening statement, sir, and again, thank you so much for being here. I hope you answer the question for those watching, exactly what is a computational biologist? And then we'll get into the virus.
Thank you, Congressman Heck. So a computational biologist, basically, so we've gone from in biology, if we go back 40 years, it was a very data poor science compared to many other sciences. And you kind of had measurements that you wrote down in a notebook, but particularly with kind of new ways that we can measure things, it's gone to being a very data rich science, and you have terabytes and terabytes of data to pour through. And so then you need a lot of kind of sophisticated analysis programs to be able to deal with all of that data. And so computational biologist will kind of lean much more on the programming computational side compared to an experimental biologist who will lean more on the lab work side. Some people kind of marry the two a bit more and do both. We do a bit of bench work in the lab and sequence viruses and so forth, but most of the work in the lab is on the computational side.
So half biologist, half mathematician and statistician?
Yeah, so my degrees are in biology, kind of all the way up. Undergrad was biology, PhD was biology, but have kind of taught myself programming and statistics and all of that side of things over the course of career. And I think that's in training people, undergrads and PhD students. That's been something that's been kind of very clear, that there's a lot of biologists who really want to dive in and take up the statistics and programming, and kind of having that combination of domain knowledge in biology with these statistical and programming skills is really helpful. And that's basically the core of data science as a emerging field, is you really want that both domain knowledge and kind of this technical know-how as well.
So where are we now, Dr. Bedford, with respect to COVID-19? What's your perspective about where we're at now? And I guess I'd like to ask you, looking back a little bit, about the journey that this virus has been on as we have seen it migrate throughout the world. And I presume you're beginning to detect some mutation, because that's what viruses do. Tell us about that journey. Tell us where we are. And then, of course, we'll save the big one for later, which is, what do you see going forward? What does your modeling, what does your mathematical analysis, as it were, of this thing suggest to us about where we're going? First, where are we and how did we get here?
Yeah, I don't think this was actually scripted, so I'll show I'll share my screen. So this is the little opening remarks that I wanted to discuss, that kind of goes through things. Let's close this. So yeah, I wanted to address exactly those questions. I think that's very key. This should be pretty quick. So how we got here, where are we now, how do we get out of here? So I want to kind of focus on how we got here from this genomic side, which is something that that is really something that I've focused on. And in how this works, and kind of in essence, is, let's say we have an epidemic. Each red dot here is some individual who gets infected with COVID. They're infected for 5 or 10 days, which is this line here. And then that individual, I'm assuming you can see my cursor, then that individual kicks off a secondary infection, infects these other two people. This person then infects another two people, and then that gives you this kind of exponential growth process behind an epidemic, and how kind of things get out of control quite quickly, or things can get out of control quite quickly. And so the usual way that we kind of try to usually look at these things is by counting cases and seeing how many confirmed cases are there through time. But with new technologies, what we can do is we can take some of these individuals, swab their noses, and sequence the genome that's infecting them. And so each of these individuals, they'll often have a slightly different virus, because SARS-CoV-2, which is they confusingly named it, is the virus that causes the disease of COVID-19. That SARS-CoV-2 mutates roughly once every 2 weeks, and so those mutations will accumulate here, where along that transmission chain, there's, say, this purple mutation, which is going to be just one single, like, A to T change out of the 30,000 letters that make up the genome. And then you'll see that these two viruses will share that purple mutation, will share that single base pair change. We see that these 4 viruses share this orange mutation. This virus here has this blue mutation. And so what we're able to do with just getting these genome sequences, we're able to determine a family tree, or an evolutionary tree, or what I'll call the technical term of art of a phylogeny. It will show you how these different viruses are related to one another. And so we can see, again, that these 2 are more closely related because they share this purple mutation. These 4 are related by the orange mutation. And what this can tell us about is we can use this family tree to learn about this underlying transmission process and how the epidemic unfolded. So if we just dive right in and look at data that we have from SARS-CoV-2, and these are now kind of snapshots through time, whereas if we look in samples that were collected in December to mid-January, all of these either came from Wuhan in Hubei in central China, or were these known travel events where there was someone like this person in this blue dot here, and here is someone that was found in Bangkok that had just traveled to Wuhan, and were kind of direct introductions. We saw that in these viruses that were collected in December and early January, they're all almost genetically identical to one another. They only differed by at most 2 mutations. And we're able to use that known mutation rate of the virus to then estimate that the common ancestor of all of these viruses was only back in late November, early December in 2019. So we know from that genetic diversity that the virus wasn't circulating for months and months beforehand, that really it was a recent emergence in Wuhan or very nearby Wuhan. And then if we go forward from January 15th to February 15th, we see the large epidemic in China. Each of these purple dots is a virus sequence from someone in China. And then we have these red dots in the US and these yellow green dots in Europe. And we can see at that point, we start to get these kind of one-off introductions of travel cases moving from China and showing up in the US and in Europe. But for the most part, those travel cases were caught and contained. However, during this time, there were some arrivals that landed in the US and in Europe that were not noticed when they arrived, and then kind of kicked off a transmission chain that wasn't being noticed. And so when we go forward to mid-February to mid-March, we can see that those transmission chains that initiated in late January and mid-February really grow to be sizable and cause epidemics within the US and in Europe from kind of these multiple origination points from China. And then we see that that if we go forward from there, that then we kind of have continual evolution and continual spread of the virus from this point. If we look just within the US, so now this is every red dot is a virus sequence from someone that was infected in the US, and we can see this this overall pattern where there was one introduction directly from China that occurred in what we believe is around the end of January, sometime around that period, that then caused the majority of the Washington state outbreak, and has spread elsewhere in the US. We have a bunch of these things that don't go anywhere. And then we have a couple introductions from Europe into New York that then go on to seed other places. And so we have kind of this mix of direct from Asia, direct from China, and via Europe introductions to the US via New York City. If we then look within the United States, orange is West Coast, green is East Coast, kind of yellows in the middle, we can see that the virus very quickly kind of mixed across the country. That once it arrived and we have these transmission chains, you can see that things are quite mixed up. And so the virus, once here, and when people weren't really paying attention to it in February and early March, it very rapidly spread. And so we look at a, so it very rapidly got us to where we are now. We think that with less movement of people now, if we kind of follow this forward and we start getting more data, we're going to expect to see kind of more of a California lineage and more of a Washington lineage and so forth. I'll pause there if you have questions on this first bit, Congressman, and then I can continue if you'd like as well.
Well, the thing that occurs to me at looking at the migration is if the coronavirus is mutating that rapidly, Dr. Bedford, in lay terms, I suppose this question would apply to all sorts of viruses. How is it that you can ever get out ahead of it with the vaccine, since it's changing on an almost daily basis? Can you explain that in lay terms? Because obviously what's being put out there is that the solution to this is to develop a vaccine, which is, of course, 10 to 18 months away, or who knows how long. There's incredible amounts of money being invested in attempting to come up with one, but it's a very dynamic virus. And so how do you ever get to a vaccine? And is this virus any more dynamic, any more rapidly evolving than the rest that we see on a periodic basis?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, so I'm gonna kind of dive in here a little bit. So the genome is 30,000 letters long, but most of those mutations have no hope of changing the virus in a way that would break a vaccine. So, so the virus is made up of kind of multiple proteins and multiple kind of machinery to replicate itself and so on. There's only kind of one protein that's on the surface of the virus, which is called spike, or S here. And spike protein mutations to spike protein could conceivably mess with the vaccine and make it so that if a vaccine targets version A of the virus, a mutation to spike that kind of changes spike protein a bit could make that vaccine less effective. Right now, if we look at spike, we can see that there's basically been just one mutation of relevance. Everything else is quite rare. And so there's kind of, rather than a mutation every 2 weeks, there's been one mutation since December in spike that could have an effect. And we see that, interestingly, that is kind of distributed. I can do this here, where these are largely European derived viruses that have this mutation in spike protein. These are viruses that were the original form from China. And we can see that in the US, there's actually a mix of these two variants between much of the East Coast is this G variant, much of Washington and California is this D variant. We'd expect that a single amino acid change, a single letter change to the protein, is likely not to have a big effect on a vaccine, on antibody binding. We can also see that for influenza, which was probably the primary research focus before January. And then in influenza, we need to the WHO every 6 months has to update the vaccine strain because flu does evolve. And then we can see these X's are representing these different vaccine viruses. And we'll see that generally, I think I have this roughly, that these are separated by 5 or 10 amino acids. There's a good number between them before you have to kind of think about updating the vaccine. So my My strong suspicion, but I can't be completely confident at this point, is that we're going to see evolution in coronavirus and SARS-CoV-2 that looks a bit flu-like, where it's not changing fast enough to completely break a vaccine, but as time goes on, we'll have a vaccine that we have in 2021, and we'll need to update the strain in the vaccine for 2022 and update the strain of the vaccine for 2023 and so forth. And we'll have some unfortunate thing where we have to keep getting revaccinated the way that we have to keep getting revaccinated for influenza. It's conceivable that it will be slower than that, but that's the I don't think it could be faster. But I think that's the most likely scenario.
So here's what I think I just heard you say, Dr. Bedford. It is mutating, as they all do, but not in a way that necessarily suggests that it will be vaccine immune, as it were, or resistant, more accurately. But I also heard you slip in there a reference to a vaccine in 2021. So you've been tracking this virus all over the globe, the way it's mutating and its path of travel. And having studied this and previous viruses for a long period of time, what is it specifically that you would say, again, not asking for a hard and fast prediction, about how long it will take us to have a vaccine? Understanding that this virus has a mind of its own, we get all those qualifiers, but and I presume you're following the literature about what different labs are trying to do and steps they're taking. Where are we, sir?
So this is hard for me to, because this is not my real area of expertise. We have people claiming that we can get something out by September. I'm not sure that's possible. But I could imagine early 2021. My understanding from coronavirus in general is that the main worry before we had some data that's emerged in the last really couple weeks is that that you would have a vaccine that you make and you try out in human volunteers, and then you find out that it doesn't induce a strong immune response, and then so you have to kind of go back to square one. The studies that early results that have come out from safety immunogenicity trials with the Moderna vaccine and also the Oxford Group's vaccine, which I don't remember the name of, shows that it has robust immune response, and so that's a good first hurdle there. You have to then, you don't know that immune response will actually be protective, which will be the next hurdle to get through. But early indications look good. My understanding, which again, this is not my core area of expertise, is that that much of the issue might not actually be getting to that initial vaccine that actually works. It will be scaling up to the billions of doses that the world needs, and so that we could end up with a first rollout of some doses in even say the fall, but that we won't be able to get everyone vaccinated until 2021.
And then the medical ethicists and a lot of other people are going to have to weigh in. Well, thank you. I knew that wasn't your core area of study, but it does. It was a question begged by your expertise, and so is this one, which is transmissibility. You're tracking this thing. You're the coronavirus detective. You're tracking it, its rate of spread, and we're hearing lots of different things. And in fact, we've heard different accounts as to how it's spread. The one thing that has seemed to be consistent from day one is that it is, relatively speaking, pretty transmissible compared to others. So can you talk about what you do know about transmissibility? And then perhaps that will segue into some of the measures that public health officers are recommending that we take. How is it transmitted? How easily is it transmitted? And maybe just a little bit about how that compares to other viruses that you've studied.
Yeah, this has been interesting and surprising. Where so the main lines of evidence that I've seen surrounding this come from contact tracing sorts of studies, where you have epidemiological investigation, you have households with an index case where the first person gets sick in the household, and then you investigate and take swabs from other people in the household to see if they get sick. And then you also do this in kind of other clusters of infection, workplaces, and so forth. There have been a number of these studies published, which are kind of traditional epidemiological investigations of things like churches, choir practice, call centers, restaurants, households, etc. And then you can see a lot of you can see transmission occurring. It is interesting and still a little bit baffling of how heterogeneous, how kind of things seem. So generally, the household attack rate, secondary attack rate. So if one person in the household is sick, the other people in the household only get sick about 20% of the time. And so it's not like everyone that's in contact with the individual necessarily gets it. But then you also have other settings like choir practice, where one person who's sick will infect 50 other people in a room, and this kind of huge variation there. And exactly kind of why someone can be in the same household with some person for days and not get sick, and you can spend an hour in choir practice with someone and be infected is unclear. The real kind of worry and kind of fundamental issue behind this transmission that has made this such a challenging disease to combat is that it's now quite clear that that the general timeline for someone becoming infectious is that they get exposed at day 0, and then they might, on average, they'll start to show symptoms at day 5. That has some decent window around it, but when they show symptoms at day 5, they've likely been infectious for days 3 and 4, and you can kind of see that they've had viral load, that they've been kind of producing virus even when they don't have symptoms. And so there seems to be a pretty large component of pre-symptomatic transmission that definitely exists. It's still debated how much asymptomatic transmission there is. We know that and this is also strange, that different studies have kind of quite a wide bar here, where in some cohorts you can find 6% of people are asymptomatic, and other cohorts you'll find 70% of people are asymptomatic. I think a lot of that derives from your definition of asymptomatic, and whether it's kind of meeting these kind of, you have to have cough and fever and something, or if it's any symptoms qualify. But whether those people that are polysymptomatic, that have very little symptoms, or truly asymptomatic, whether you get transmission in those settings. And so maybe finally this is one of the core public health rationales behind the mask recommendation, is that the mask is to protect others, not primarily yourself. And if you have these frequent situations where someone can be infectious and not showing symptoms, then the best thing they can do is be wearing a mask to protect those around them.
Thank you. I'm feeling guilty because we're a good way into this, and we haven't yet turned over to the people who pre-submitted questions or asked them live. So Lauren, I want to go back to you and ask if you have some questions that you want to advance at this point.
Yes. Before I get started on questions, I would just like to note that we're getting some feedback that people are having challenges streaming the video live, but the whole video will be recorded and can be accessed at full on Facebook at the end of the broadcast. Our first question now will come from Roger and was submitted through constituent mail. The current pandemic is a breeding ground for destructive activity as leaders seek to force people to stop working, stay away from family, stay away from church, and so forth. While there is a need to distance ourselves from each other during this pandemic, are there ways in which we can function with a high degree of safety and still be productive? Congressman Heck?
Thank you. First of all, I want to assure you, Roger, that there's nobody that wants to get as many people back to work as quickly as possible as I do, nor enable them to return to their houses of worship, including myself, by the way, something that I am missing on a weekly basis. And indeed, the measures that have been advanced and recommended by the scientists and by the public health officials and by Governor Inslee are as a consequence of their conclusion that to not do so would not just jeopardize lives, but in fact would delay the ability for us to restart fully our economy and return to a normal life, including, for example, participation in weekly church services. And the reason for that is that if people actually go out without the appropriate protective measures or too early, and there is a second wave or a significant flare, it won't matter what the governor's executive order is. People on an individual basis will be making the decisions that they don't want to put themselves at risk. And we actually have an antecedent for this in history. I like to cite what happened at the end of World War I, when it was concluding and several major Eastern cities were planning in the street celebrations, but then canceled them because of the risk of a second wave of the Spanish influenza, except Philadelphia. And indeed, Philadelphia had a flare as the second wave hit America, and Philadelphia's economy was the last to recover from the second wave because of the severity with which they had been hit. So what we're trying to do here is actually get the economy going and enable us to go down, in my case, to Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd just down the street on a regular Sunday basis. So that's what we're actually trying to do. Dr. Bedford, I'm going to ask you as it relates to the question about what can be done. The conventional wisdom now among those of us who want to have protective measures and restore as much normalcy as soon as possible is that what we need to do is test more robustly, contact trace, and isolate those that have been indicated to have an infection. And that's kind of accepted among many people. But I want to ask you, are those the appropriate measures in order, as it were, to corral, if not defeat this virus over the long term, while we are simultaneously investing in both therapies and a vaccine?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So that test, trace, isolate is the primary public health intervention that we have at hand. We also know that it works. So we can look at cases like a lot of people. So South Korea is very obvious as that they were able to ramp up and manage this thing, but we also have countries like Vietnam that were able to completely suppress the epidemic via test, trace, isolate, and kind of quarantine measures, and actually having this intervention to stop transmission. And you can think of that as person A gets sick, they at day 5 they present with their with symptoms. If they get tested right away, you can then go in, interview that person, find out who they've been in contact with, and then test those other people and isolate them, quarantine them before they can actually spread the virus. And this intervention is known to work. Like it's known to work in general for things like Ebola and tuberculosis, but we know it also to work for SARS-CoV-2. So I think that is exactly where we should be aiming to build up our public health capacity. This we still need for Washington State. We need more testing and faster and more contact tracing. It's being ramped up very quickly, but that's something to kind of be completely focused on. In addition, with a kind of emerging epidemiological, these investigations that I was discussing, we can start to figure out what are actually the risky activities and what are the safer activities. And so we're seeing things like, generally we haven't seen very much spread out of doors. And so that kind of has implications in terms of national parks and so forth. And so we can start to make smarter decisions about what activities should be limited and what activities should continue or should be reinstated.
So I want to put a little context to the testing portion of that in our state. We have the lab capacity to perform the amount of tests that we need. What we don't have are the supplies to perform the test, nor the equipment or the transport materials to get those swabs to the labs. So right now we're about 4,000 to 6,000 tests a day, But what the public health people say is we need to be somewhere between 20 and 30,000 to kind of optimize this test, contact, trace, and isolate. Lauren, next question, please.
Yes, our next question comes from a Facebook Live viewer named Richard. I've had 35 flu shots. Will I get coronavirus? Dr. Bedford, would you like to answer that?
Sure. Unfortunately, unfortunately, that there should be, I'd expect pretty much no chance of a flu shot protecting against coronavirus. The only way that there could be some interaction is somehow a recent flu shot generally primes your immune system rather than having a specific response. But I'd strongly suspect that there wouldn't be anything there. That it'll be another vaccine that we'll have to get every year, which won't be fun, but should be effective.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Twitter. How are the forecasts so radically wrong they inspired ruining the livelihoods of 45 million now unemployed Americans? Dr. Bedford?
Mm-hmm. So this has been interesting, where many of the early forecasts, and maybe forecast is like, you have to think of this word as the way that many of the folks in the epidemiological modeling community, which I'm kind of adjacent to, I don't do these forecasts myself, but I am colleagues with people who make them and who work on this, where it's kind of in many ways or can often be a way to kind of formalize your thinking surrounding a problem, and like, if we do X, Y, and Z, what will happen? And so the forecasts of 2 million deaths in the United States were made under the let's pretend America does nothing, and let's everyone just continues and acts exactly as they were before. And then, because this thing is quite transmissible, we know that if everyone were to just behave like they always did, we'd expect by the end of the summer, roughly, that 80% of the US will have got this thing. And then, even though it's the infection to fatality ratio is not huge, it's still something like 0.5% or 1%. And so in that 0.5% to 1% range, if you have 80% of America getting this, you end up with 1 or 2 million deaths. And so that is kind of the fundamentals to that quote forecast. I think what the nuance here, which is a little bit difficult, is that that even if we did not have mandated social distancing policies, stay home, stay safe, etc., people would have also behaved differently, and they would be interacting less, and people would be scared of getting sick, and we'd have decreases in transmission. So I don't think that there was any scenario where we would actually get to 2 million deaths. The question is the delta, the difference between the policy-oriented approach versus something more like what Sweden has done, and what let's kind of leave it up to the virus. And so this answering that fully is quite challenging. We do see that for states, we have this at the kind of individual state level data for Google and Apple mobility data of how people have been moving around. And we can see a very strong correlation between people, between social distancing and decrease of viral spread. This has been quite clear. So if policies cause people to social distance, they should have decreased viral spread. This is also clear. The exact delta between the scenario that would have happened if you hadn't made this policy and the scenario that did happen because this policy was in place is quite challenging to figure out. But we do know that social distancing decreases spread and saves lives, and ideally brings things down to the point where test, trace, isolate can be ramped up, and then we can kind of bring things back online in a fully safe and productive fashion without having to worry about a second wave or flare-ups disrupting things again.
And that's everybody's goal, right? Everybody wants us to be able to bring the economy back up
Yes.
as soon as safely possible. And I don't think we are well served in this debate about the need or the necessity or the importance to socially distance and to ramp up our testing, contact tracing, isolating. I don't think we're well served in pursuit of that by refusing to acknowledge that there is an unbelievable amount of harm and damage being done to people's lives as a consequence. I mean, after all, we now have unemployment levels rivaling that of the Great Depression. So for those of us of an age who had parents that lived through it, or grandparents even, we know how indelibly on their soul and on their psyche that period of deprivation and hardship was upon them. And nobody wants that. It's part of why the Congress has passed already 4 bills totaling more than $3 trillion to try to mitigate the free fall of the economy. And in fact, the House passed the other one, the HEROES Act, for an additional $3.2 trillion to try to abate that damage. But there's no question that social distancing is causing this damage and hurt, and we should acknowledge that for what it is, because it is very real.
Yeah.
Lauren, next question, please.
Thank you. Our next question comes from former State Rep Tammy Green and was asked on Facebook Live. Healthcare workers are being infected every shift. How often should they be tested? Congressman Heck?
Well, that's a medical question. I think Dr. Bedford is better able to answer. Just let me say hello to my friend Tammy, whom I know well, and thank you for tuning in. Thank you for the work you do every day. She's, of course, a registered nurse out on the front lines on a day in and day out basis. I do want you to know that the Congress has recognized this risk in a number of ways. First of all, it provided billions of dollars in additional assistance to ensure that people who work in healthcare delivery especially, but all sorts of other essential work that interfaces with other members of the public, with money to provide the personal protective equipment that is now finding its way out into the system. Nobody should go to work in that kind of an environment without a rock solid assurance that they're going to at least be given the protective mask and gowns and booties and the other kinds of things that can help keep them safe. But we also recognize the heroic nature of their work, which is why the bill is called the HEROES Act, in providing them with additional hazard pay, because they really are deployed in combat type duty. And I want to recognize that and honor them for that, and honor you for that as well, Tammy, as well as your considerable public service. Dr. Bedford, how often should they be tested?
Yeah, it's like I've been working 12 to 14-hour days since January, but I've been able to do that from my dining room table. It's not at all it's not at all the same. Thank you, Tammy. Generally, we have this. If we think about, again, this like normal time frame where someone's exposed at day 0, they become infectious at day 5, they show symptoms at day 5, they become infectious at day 3. We have this 48-hour window in which that we have possible infectiousness without symptoms. So you'd like if testing was completely free and not uncomfortable, you could imagine having a screening every 2 days, and you every 36 hours, or sorry, 48 hours, and you definitely capture everything. I don't think that is as kind of feasible. I think the once weekly testing is probably the way to go. Normally that when I see modeling work on this, it surrounds kind of that as a larger intervention where you kind of want to lean more on the contact tracing side to pick up rings of infections to find things rather than just kind of massively testing everyone. But for high risk populations such as healthcare workers, that equation is probably a bit different, and you might want to do things more often. It's hard for me to give a exact number. I think it's like it revolves around would those tests get is this zero sum? Like if the healthcare worker is getting tested, does that prevent someone else from being tested, or could we actually ramp up that capacity in this case?
We have a long way to go, as I indicated, at fewer than 6,000 a day in this state, with more than 7.5 million people, and we need to be at 20 to 30,000 to get anywhere near the kind of containment that I think that we all hope for. And again, that's a function of a choke point in the supplies. It's not the lab analysis. It's, do we have enough swabs and enough things to send them safely and in a sterile capacity to the labs? And we're working very hard at that. It's why some of us, since day one, frankly, we're advocating so strongly for the president to utilize the powers of the Defense Production Act, which would enable him to mobilize America's great manufacturing might to meet a national emergency. And frankly, from where I sit, this is a national emergency. Indeed, the president has officially declared it so. Lauren.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Chana, a live viewer. How much of a concern are mutations, current or future? And is the potential for a second wave really a big concern? Dr. Bedford?
So yeah, mutations. This is something where generally we have now out of the 30,000 virus genomes that we've seen that have been collected and sequenced. So 30,000 people across the world that have been sequenced, infections that have been sequenced. We have something like 10,000 different mutations that we've discovered in all of those individuals, a huge number. Most of those mutations are going to kind of be one-off or going to be rare things. We have maybe about 14, somewhere in there, a couple dozen mutations that are at sizable frequency across the world. We suspect that most of those also don't really do anything. The exception to that might be the one that I was pointing out that is in spike protein that sits on the kind of European lineage. That that has risen in frequency in places where it's landed, and the worry / idea is that it is more transmissible in some fashion. We see people that have that virus will sometimes have a higher viral load. They don't seem to show worse clinical outcomes compared to other individuals. So it doesn't seem more severe, but it seems like it may be slightly more transmissible. We need kind of more evidence of this for whether that's the case. I'd expect that we could see kind of some of this minor variation accrue over the coming months for strains that have emerged that are somewhat different, but that level of difference will be kind of very small compared to the kind of the general existing level of transmissibility and severity of the virus. It's not likely to get much more severe or much more transmissible. In many cases, it's hard to figure out what way things will pivot. That evolution wants a more transmissible virus. That the way you can get there is sometimes by attenuating the disease, so things are less severe, so people kind of spread it more. But the other way evolution can get there is by having higher viral loads and having kind of more virus in someone. And so it's not exactly clear what direction things push there. So generally, it's something I think to be watching for, but it's not something to be like overly concerned about. That I think the virus that we have now is bad enough. And there was a second part of the question that I've now forgotten. What was that again?
Second wave.
Second wave. Yeah. So this is something where we've been seeing things trend down in cases per day. So we've gone from a peak of 30,000 to now about 20,000 over the course of April, May. And so that decline is kind of now being played off against people are starting to across the country are starting to mix more, are starting to have more activities. That should increase transmission just from everything we know about the virus. But we also have have some amount of seasonality. We see that coronaviruses in general, seasonal coronaviruses, are winter diseases, and then in the summertime they don't show as much transmission. And so we have these two things kind of playing off as summer ramps up and activities kind of tick up as well, that I think things could go either way a bit, and we could see kind of things tick up a little bit, but not hugely, or they could continue back down nationally. The worry is that come fall, when seasonality starts to reverse, and that we have kind of continual fatigue from these social distancing activities, which are quite straining, that then at that point you'd have to worry more about a second wave. So I think there, if we imagine kind of a sharper uptick of transmission, it would be something more like October that we'd be more concerned about.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Rob, a Facebook Live viewer. Denny, why aren't you in Washington, D.C. voting and doing the work of Congress?
I am in Olympia, Washington, doing the work of Congress. As most people are aware, Congress 2 weeks ago, when I was in Washington, D.C., actually participated in supporting the first time in our nation's history amendment to our rules to allow for proxy voting. So I am here. I was working on my congressional responsibilities for most of the day. And in fact, I voted. I had to send very specific written instructions as to each and every vote before the House to my colleague in Washington, D.C., who then cast my vote. And the reason that I chose not to go was because, frankly, the 3 medical doctors who are members of the House Democratic Caucus all stayed home and said that that was the thing to do, as did my physician. And as a consequence, given that I could continue to do my job, I chose to stay in Olympia and continue to be your congressman.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking, Rob.
Our next question also comes from a Facebook Live viewer named Kim. Dr. Bedford, can you describe your new assessment about the first community case in Washington and its relation to the Washington outbreak?
So, yeah, so if we think about the timeline here, that that we had on January 15th, there was an individual that returned directly from Wuhan to Snohomish, was screened on January 19th and was COVID positive. That was the first positive case in the nation. There was an intensive contact tracing investigation of that individual. They screened, the Washington Department of Health screened all of their contacts, did not find anyone that was sick. Then on February 29th, we had finished, on February 27th, we had screened the teenager from Snohomish. That was Washington 2. That was the first community case discovered. And then we had the genome sequence from that virus on February 29th. The genome sequence of that virus from February 29th was very similar. It differed by only 2 mutations from this Washington 1 virus from mid-January. And that there's a large diversity of viruses circulating in China, or that there had been, and that small 2 mutation difference was quite statistically significant. Not completely slam dunk. The chance of the very rough chance of a kind of random statistical collision there, where things just looked that similar by chance from a second a separate introduction, was about 3%. And so then made the call that we think that really Washington 1 in mid-January resulted in onward transmission until that was then picked up in February, at the end of February, with the outbreak that we sustained. Then as we sequenced more and more viruses throughout March, we saw that kind of everything fit closely with this Washington 2 kind of type, that everything was 2 mutations away from Washington 1, which was a little weird, and definitely was not expecting that. I was expecting to kind of fill in that lineage connecting Washington 1 to Washington 2. And then the other thing that cropped up was that there was viruses that were sequenced from British Columbia, from Vancouver, that actually did fit in between, and kind of there was no longer just the direct line from within Seattle area from Washington 1 in mid-January to viruses in the Seattle, Washington State outbreak in late February and mid-February. And so at this point, I don't think it's I don't exclude the possibility of still a Washington 1 introduction, that somehow there was a chain of transmission that was missed from that person. But I think the more likely outcome is that there was another introduction that happened in late January that was either directly, late January, early February, that was either directly to Seattle area or possibly via British Columbia, unclear the exact historical origins. And that was really what sparked the outbreak in Washington State. We had screened through the Seattle flu study. We'd screened thousands of viruses from January 1st all the way through March 15th. And then in those historical viruses that we looked at, historical samples that we looked at, we didn't see any COVID positive samples until February 21st. Along the same day as that Washington 2 sample from the teenager was collected. So we know that it wasn't circulating strongly in January and say early February, but still kind of our best guess is an introduction, around February 1st, end of January, beginning of February, that ramps up to about maybe 1,000 to 2,000 infections by the end of February, at which point the outbreak was detected, when we had these 1,000 or 2,000 infections at that point.
So Dr. Bedford, I hope a little more simply, what you do is you look at the characteristics or the markers of samples from all over the world, including here. And because therefore they have, as it were, unique signatures, you can tell, well, this one came directly from Wuhan, or this one's a couple of generations removed. And that's how it is that you came to be known as the coronavirus detective, following the migration and the evolution of the signature of the virus in each person as infected, that enables you to see what its origin was and to some degree where it may have came from. Its lineage, I guess. Lauren,
Yes.
More questions?
Yes. Our next question comes from Doug and was submitted through constituent mail. Why not make teleworking mandatory for some jobs going forward? The upside is that you take a bunch of cars off the roads during commute times, reduce air pollution, and slow down the need to keep building high-rise buildings. I really believe this is an opportunity to rethink how our society works in many areas, not just how we do white-collar work. Congressman Heck?
Well, I do think it's an opportunity, Doug. Thank you for the question. And I think that if we could get past the fact that there are an awful lot of people whose lives have been damaged by the economic, the self-induced or the voluntary coma we've put a lot of the economy in. But if people that can telecommute do telecommute more going forward, there will be considerable benefits to it. And in fact, I think it's pretty clear it's pretty clear already that that's likely to be the case, as people have actually grown used to it. We've kind of culturally gotten beyond the river of concern or doubt about how it might work, when in fact it's working pretty well, and at least on a hybrid basis, meaning telecommute more days of the week than not. As to mandating it, I'm not sure that the government has the constitutional authority to mandate how a business actually engages in commerce. But the fact of the matter is there are ways to create incentives, and not the least of which is worker preference, and how people have grown used to this and how they want to continue to do that on an ongoing basis. I think you're absolutely right. There will be more telecommuting, without a doubt, going into the future. And there is a good part of that that is very positive.
Thank you. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask one last question and then turn it over to Dr. Bedford and Congressman Heck for some closing remarks. Our final question comes from Greg and was written in constituent mail. What are our representatives doing to pressure the governor to open up the economy? I believe that it is important for those who represent the people to lobby for the state to open up so that many jobs and businesses will be saved. Congressman Heck?
Well, thank you, Greg, very much. We actually have twice weekly telephone conversations between the congressional delegation, excuse me, and the governor or his team, and exchange information about what it is the federal government can do and what it is that the state government can do. Again, however, Greg, I'm going to suggest to you that we are in a position and have the perspective that we need to get this economy opened as soon as is safely possible. And that's the key, that we cannot do this faster than we can stand up some of these public health measures or encourage people to actually utilize them so that we can avoid an even worse crash of the economy. Again, I want to reiterate something I said earlier. The economy has been placed into a voluntary coma. That is true by virtue of the governor's executive order. But there has been no, as it were, law enforcement enforcement of that. In fact, it's been largely adhered to on a voluntary basis because people acknowledge the public health benefits and importance to saving lives. And even if the governor were to withdraw it, there might in fact be a surge in less social distancing, as it were, and less safe public health practices. But we know with a certainty, on the basis of everything that Dr. Bedford has said here earlier and other public health officials and medical people, that there would be a surge in the virus. And that would cause people to then, in turn, voluntarily withdraw from the economy. We have, if we want the economy to reopen as fully as is possible, we have to defeat the virus in the way and through the measures that we've talked about. And in the meantime, it's the responsibility of government to cushion the shock of this terrible, terrible thing as much as possible so that we all get back to where we want to, which is a substantial increase in open businesses and people getting back to work.
Thank you so much. And that concludes our town hall with Dr. Trevor Bedford. Would you like to both take a moment to provide some closing remarks?
Dr. Bedford, please.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Under the circumstances, I think that the kind of everyone should just be fully focused on this test, trace, isolate. It's such an obvious thing to be investing in and working on, especially when you think about if we have to hire an army of contact tracers, there are people that right now that could do that, and that making that happen is hugely important. And right now there seems to be it's feeling like there's, with like cases trending down, that kind of there's less people are feeling less urgency about this, but really kind of getting this in place as quickly as possible will kind of allow a safe return to normalcy. And you can also imagine that general strategy working. So it's like the thing that public health should do at a county and state level. But if you have a large workplace, if you can kind of organize, that workplace can self-organize some ability to do testing and contact tracing, then that takes load off of public health to do that activity as well. And you can imagine this as a general strategy at multiple levels to be able to combat the virus. And it's something that kind of, can be invested in and paid attention to across society.
Dr. Bedford, it's been a true honor to have you on. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that when you were doing your doctoral work and your postdoc work, you never imagined that you would become a Twitter celebrity on an international basis, as you in fact have. And I want to acknowledge as well the Fred Hutch at which you work. This is a regional and indeed a national, if not international, treasure that is in our backyard for all the work they do in cancer treatment and therapies. It is such a blessing to have them as a part of our region and to have all the people who work there who contribute so significantly to scientific advances, including you, sir. We are honored by your presence and we are grateful for it. As we are all of those of you who joined us. Stay tuned. We will have more episodes in our continuing series of helping explain what it is we can do, what we should do, and hearing from you about what you would like us to do to deal with this pandemic. Thanks again for joining us.